5 places you'll need to avoid during a disaster. Number 1 is grocery stores. As already mentioned, going to grocery stores and supermarkets is a really bad idea since you can expect a mob of desperate, unprepared people, which presents a huge security risk to you. With so many people trying to get the same basic supplies like food and water, grocery stores won't have enough stocks to accommodate all of the demand. With the limited supply of goods, most people will be mentally distressed during a disaster, and it won't come as a surprise to anyone if they become violent or aggressive in trying to get vital supplies. This makes these type of locations probably the most dangerous in these moments. The sudden surge of people and demand is not the only problem as to why supplies will be scarce. Most, if not all, grocery stores and supermarkets in the U.S. use what we call a just-in-time delivery system in getting the stocks for their respective stores. This type of system basically provides stores with only enough stocks that they will need for a typical day, making them susceptible to sudden demands like during a disaster. This is why even if there is an unexpected disaster, stores simply cannot adjust their stocks and order more at the same level of demand, since the just-in-time system relies on a delicate and complicated process, making it almost impossible to scale up quickly under these types of unexpected load. In order to avoid going to grocery stores during a disaster or just prior to it, you need to prepare in advance. It's important that you have a stock of food that are not easy to perish, as well as clean water in your home, even if there isn't a disaster approaching. The reason for this is that disasters can happen anytime and without warning. So if you're not prepared, you'll be scrambling for supplies like everyone else. When getting food and water, it's important that you at least have a 2 weeks worth of supplies, since you'll never know how long a disaster will last or when help will arrive. Make sure that you have separate clean water used for cleaning and another one for drinking. Also, make sure that your home has an ample space to store at least a minimum of a 2 weeks worth of food and water. In this cashless age, people are becoming more reliant on using credit card or debit cards for their transactions. And why not? They're more convenient and they beat carrying cash in your wallet. But during a disaster, cashless transactions will be impossible since there will likely be communication and electrical outages. Stores simply won't have the capacity to accept credit or debit card payments since the terminals that process the transactions will likely not be functioning. ATM machines won't be working as well since they require electricity in a line of communication with a bank to function. One example of this is when Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, and Southern California Edison decided to cut power to the majority of their customers for several days to prevent the risk of wildfires just recently here in California. Since ATM machines and credit card terminals rely on electricity to function, it was advised that residents affected load up on cash prior to the power outage. There's a possibility that ATM machines could be affected by the power outage, and this caused residents to line up at ATM machines to withdraw as much cash as they could. Another example is after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. One of the effects of the strong hurricane was that there was an electrical and communication outage in the entire country, making many ATM machines useless. Stores and merchants also were unable to process credit or debit card payments during that time, making the country rely on cash-only transactions. This was problematic, especially for those who were unable to load up on cash prior to the disaster. They couldn't purchase important supplies from stores that were open since they couldn't use their credit card or debit cards. And at the places where ATM machines were functioning, the lines were extremely long. The cash supply on these machines, by the way, is not infinite, and not everyone who lines up is going to be able to get the cash they need, so prepare for that in advance. To avoid having this kind of problem during disaster, it's important that you always keep cash on hand. Make sure you prepare an emergency cash supply in your house that you only access during a disaster. The survey showed that 25% of Americans say they can only go without their drugs for 2 to 3 days before any negative health effects are felt. This also shows that when a disaster strikes, there will be many Americans lining up at drugstores trying to get prescription medications that they need. Though there are already programs in place that allow pharmaceutical companies to respond properly during disasters, it won't be uncommon for drugstores to have long lines or run out of inventory, especially if drugstores also use the just-in-time delivery system for their supplies. Like point number 1, when this happens, expect people to get desperate. Aside from the long lines and inventory running out, most drugstores that are open during a disaster won't be able to process any other forms of transactions other than cash. This could be a problem for people who weren't able to prepare enough cash for their medications. And as mentioned earlier, when people are in a stressful situation, they become mentally distressed, experiencing depression, anxiety, or even post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Couple this with the desperation and feelings of having their personal safety and well-being threatened, they could commit violent acts just to get their medication. One thing that you can do to avoid going to drugstores during an emergency is to stock up on medications and other medical supplies and equipment you might need ahead of time. You need to make sure that you are also prepared to be able to store your medicine, especially if the medicine you're taking requires being put in a refrigerator. You also need to consider as well how much medicine you are allowed to purchase, since there's a limit for certain prescription medications. Another thing you can do is consider finding a natural alternative to the medication you are taking, or you will likely take. Number 4, high density population areas. If you live in a high density population area like an apartment building, high rises, or downtown areas, then it is even more important that you are prepared for disaster. This is because high density population areas are one of the most dangerous places you can be and you need to avoid during a disaster. One of the main issues with high density population areas is that it is filled with a whole lot of people that are probably not prepared to survive